Every cabin on the frontier had the same enemy at the door, not wolves, not wind, not the cold itself exactly, though the cold was the instrument of the damage. The enemy was the air exchange that occurred every time the door opened. A frontier cabin door, typically 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall, 18 square feet of opening, connected the warm interior directly to the frozen exterior, and every time that door swung open, the warm cabin air and the cold outside air changed places with a speed and violence that was invisible but devastating. The physics were simple and merciless. Warm air is lighter than cold air. When the door opens, the warm cabin air, heated to 60 or 65 degrees by hours of stove work, rushes out through the upper portion of the doorway, rising like smoke into the freezing sky. Simultaneously, the cold outside air, 0 degrees, 10 below, 20 below, pours in through the lower portion of the doorway, flooding the cabin floor with a river of frigid air that spreads across every surface at ankle height. The exchange takes approximately 15 to 20 seconds to complete a full volume replacement through an open door, and even a quick pass through the door, 2 seconds of full opening, 3 seconds of partial opening as the person squeezes through, allows approximately 10 to 15% of the cabin's warm air to escape and be replaced by an equal volume of cold air. A frontier family opened the door an average of 20 to 30 times per day. Trips to the woodpile, trips to the outhouse, trips to the barn, trips to the well, children going out and coming in, the dog going out and coming in. Each opening cost 10 to 15% of the cabin's warm air. Over 20 openings, the cumulative air exchange was equivalent to replacing the cabin's entire air volume 2 to 3 times, meaning that the stove was not merely heating the cabin, but was reheating the cabin continuously, fighting a battle against the door that consumed 20 to 30% of the total fuel burned. Every frontier builder knew the door was a problem. The standard solutions were inadequate. A heavy blanket hung inside the door reduced the air exchange by perhaps 30%. Better than nothing, but the blanket had to be pushed aside to pass through, and the pushing created gaps that allowed the cold air to pour in around the edges. A small vestibule, a lean-to built against the exterior of the door, created a buffer zone, but the vestibule was unheated, and its own door was usually poorly sealed, so the temperature inside the vestibule was only marginally warmer than the outside air, and the air exchange when the inner door opened was only slightly reduced. Tarak Unark had a different solution. He had grown up with it, and in the winter of 1891, on the high Montana plains, he built it. Tarak was not from Montana. He was from the north, the far north, the place beyond the tree line, where the land flattened into tundra, and the winter darkness lasted 20 hours, and the cold was not a season, but a permanent condition of existence that shaped every structure, every tool, every practice, and every thought. Tarak was Inupiat. Born in a village on the coast of the Chukchi Sea, in what Americans called Alaska Territory, raised in the tradition of the Kazgik, the men's community house, and the semi-subterranean sod houses that his people had built for thousands of years in the most extreme cold climate inhabited by humans. He was 38 years old, a compact man with a broad, flat face, weathered dark by decades of Arctic wind, deep brown eyes set in a permanent squint against snow glare, high, flat cheekbones, a wide nose, thin lips chapped and cracked from cold, black hair cropped short under a heavy fur-lined hood. His hands were square and powerful, scarred across the knuckles from years of working with bone tools, stone, ice, and hide. He wore a heavy caribou skin parka with the fur turned inward against his body, caribou skin trousers, and sealskin boots lined with dried grass. The clothing of the Arctic, designed to trap body heat in still air layers between the skin and the fur. Tareq had come south in 1888, traveling with a group of Inupiat men who had been recruited to work at a trading post on the upper Missouri River. When the trading post closed in 1890, Tareq stayed, drawn by the relative warmth of the Montana climate, which he found almost tropical compared to the Chukchi coast, by the availability of wood, which was scarce to non-existent in his homeland, and by a woman named Mary Redhawk, a Crow woman who worked at the trading post and who became his wife in the autumn of 1890. They settled on a parcel of unclaimed land in the high country east of the Rocky Mountain front, where the Montana plains rose toward the mountains, and the winter wind came down from the peaks with a cold that, while less extreme than the Arctic, was severe enough to test any shelter, temperatures regularly dropping to 25 below zero in January, with wind chills that exceeded 50 below during storms. The cabin that Tareq built in the summer of 1891 was conventional in its above-ground construction. Cottonwood logs from the river bottom, chinked with clay and dried grass, roofed with poles and sod, a stone chimney with a cast-iron stove. It was a competent cabin, warm enough with a good fire, tight enough to resist moderate wind. But the door was the standard frontier door, 3 feet wide, 6 feet tall, opening directly from the cabin interior to the outside. And Tareq knew from his first look at it that the door would be the cabin's greatest weakness. In the Arctic, the Inupiat had solved the door problem 1,000 years ago. The solution was the Katak, the entrance tunnel. The Katak was a passage that descended below floor level, ran horizontally for 6 to 10 feet, and then rose back up into the interior of the house. The passage was narrow, wide enough for one person crawling, and low, high enough to crawl through but not to stand. And it was below the floor. The physics of the Katak exploited the same principle that made the door a problem. Warm air rises and cold air sinks. In a standard door, the warm and cold air exchanged freely because the door opening extended from floor to ceiling. The warm air escaped through the top, while the cold air entered through the bottom. In the Katak, the entrance was below the floor level of the house. The warm air inside the house, being lighter than the cold air, could not flow downward through the Katak. It stayed at ceiling and floor level inside the house, trapped by its own buoyancy. The cold air outside, being heavier, sank into the Katak entrance and pooled at the bottom of the passage. But it could not rise up into the house because the warm air above the floor level blocked it. The Katak created a thermal seal, not with a door or a curtain or a physical barrier, but with physics itself. The density difference between warm air and cold air was the seal, and it was perfect, continuous, and required no hardware, no maintenance, and no effort to operate. Tareq could not build a traditional Katak at the Montana cabin. The Katak required a semi-subterranean house. The floor of the living space had to be elevated above the entrance tunnel, which meant the house had to be dug into the ground with the floor at or below ground level, and the entrance descending even further below. The Montana cabin was above ground, with a floor at ground level, and excavating beneath it for a traditional Katak entrance was impractical given the rocky soil and the existing construction. But the principle could be adapted, and the adaptation used snow. If you want to know what happened when an Inupiat man from the Arctic built a snow tunnel to his front door, while every neighbor said he was digging his own grave, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The Montana winter provided the material. By December, the snow depth on the high plains was typically 18 to 24 inches, and the drifts against the cabin's windward wall, the north wall facing the prevailing winter wind, accumulated to 3 to 4 feet. Tarak used this snow to construct a tunnel from the cabin door to a point approximately 8 feet away from the cabin, where the tunnel entrance opened at ground level. The construction began after the first major snowfall of December 1891. Tarak packed the existing snow into dense walls using a flat board as a compressor, building up the sides of the tunnel to a height of approximately 3 feet, high enough to crawl through comfortably on hands and knees. The tunnel was 3 feet wide and 8 feet long, running in a straight line from the cabin door to the entrance point. The roof of the tunnel was formed by laying poles across the top of the snow walls and packing additional snow over the poles to a thickness of 6 to 8 inches, creating a solid snow arch that supported its own weight and any additional snowfall. The critical design element was the floor level. The tunnel floor was at ground level, approximately 18 inches below the cabin floor, which sat on a foundation of log sills that raised it above the ground surface. This 18-inch drop from the cabin floor to the tunnel floor was the thermal trap. When the cabin door opened, the warm cabin air, at 60 to 65 degrees, stayed at floor level and above, held in place by its buoyancy. The cold tunnel air, at approximately 20 to 25 degrees, warmer than the outside air because the snow walls insulated the tunnel, pooled in the tunnel below the cabin floor level, unable to rise into the warm cabin above. The effect was immediate and dramatic. On the first morning after the tunnel was completed, Tarak opened the cabin door and felt nothing. No blast of cold air at his feet, no rush of warm air overhead, no violent exchange of cabin warmth for outside cold. The air in the doorway was still. The warm air inside the cabin stayed inside. The cold air in the tunnel stayed in the tunnel. The two air masses, separated by the 18-inch elevation difference, coexisted in stable equilibrium, each held in place by its own density. Mary noticed the difference before Tarak could explain it. She was standing at the stove, 6 feet from the open door, and she did not feel the cold. In every previous door opening, in every cabin she had ever lived in, the opening of the door had sent a wave of cold air across the floor that reached every corner of the room within seconds, chilling ankles, cooling the floor, and forcing the stove to work harder to recover the lost heat. With the tunnel, the door opened and the floor stayed warm. The air at ankle height stayed warm. The stove continued its steady, moderate burn without interruption. The door was open, and the cold was not entering. Tarak crawled through the tunnel to demonstrate the passage. The tunnel was cold, 22 degrees, measured by placing his hand on the snow wall and estimating from experience. But the cold was contained within the tunnel. At the tunnel entrance, the outside air at 5 below zero pooled at ground level and seeped into the tunnel, cooling the tunnel air and the snow walls. At the tunnel exit, the cabin door, the cold tunnel air sat below the cabin floor level, unable to rise. The 18-inch step up from the tunnel floor to the cabin floor was the thermal barrier, and it was holding. The door could remain open indefinitely without significant heat loss. Tarak tested this by leaving the cabin door open for 30 minutes on a morning when the outdoor temperature was 8 below zero. In a conventional cabin, 30 minutes of open door would have cooled the interior by 15 to 20 degrees. A catastrophic loss that would require an hour of hard stove work to recover. With the tunnel, the cabin temperature dropped by 2 degrees over 30 minutes, from 63 to 61, a loss attributable to the slow, conductive cooling through the open doorway and the gradual mixing of air at the boundary between the warm cabin air and the cold tunnel air, not the wholesale air exchange that an open door normally produced. If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because the quiet engineering that kept families alive and farms running for generations deserves to be remembered. The fuel savings were substantial. Before the tunnel, the cabin consumed approximately 4.5 cords of mixed wood per winter. Cottonwood, pine, and whatever hardwood could be obtained from the river bottom. The door-related heat loss accounted for an estimated 20 to 30% of total fuel consumption. The constant reheating required by 20 to 30 daily door openings, each dumping 10 to 15% of the cabin's warm air into the sky. After the tunnel, the door-related heat loss dropped to approximately 5%. The residual conductive and mixing losses through the open doorway, and the first winter's total fuel consumption dropped to approximately 3.25 cords. The savings of 1.25 cords, worth approximately $7.50 at local prices, represented a 28% reduction in fuel use, achieved entirely by changing the geometry of the entrance. The daily routine adapted to the tunnel quickly. Mary, who had initially been skeptical of crawling on hands and knees through a snow passage, found that the tunnel was warmer and more pleasant than the direct exposure of stepping through a conventional door into the wind. The tunnel was still. The snow walls blocked the wind entirely, and the temperature inside the tunnel, while cold, was 30 to 40 degrees warmer than the wind chill outside the tunnel. On days when the wind drove the effective temperature to 40 or 50 below zero, the tunnel provided a sheltered transition zone where the body could adjust between the cabin's 60 degrees and the outside's extreme cold, rather than the brutal, instantaneous exposure of stepping from a warm cabin directly into a sub-zero wind. The children, Mary's 2 sons from her first marriage, James, who was 10, and Robert, who was 7, treated the tunnel as an adventure rather than an inconvenience. They crawled through it at high speed, racing each other, and they appreciated that the tunnel entrance was invisible from a distance. The opening was at ground level, masked by the surrounding snow, and the tunnel itself was buried under the snowpack that drifted against the cabin wall. The cabin appeared from the outside to have no door at all. A snow-buried structure with smoke rising from the chimney and no visible entrance. Visitors who arrived at the cabin for the first time often circled the building looking for the door before Tarak or Mary called out from the tunnel entrance to direct them. The structural maintenance of the tunnel was the only ongoing labor the system required. Fresh snowfall had to be cleared from the tunnel entrance to prevent burial, and the tunnel roof had to be reinforced after heavy storms that deposited additional weight on the pole and snow arch. Tarak performed this maintenance approximately twice per week during active snowfall periods, a task that took 15 to 20 minutes and involved shoveling the entrance clear and packing additional snow onto any sections of the roof that had sagged or thinned. The tunnel walls, once packed and frozen, were remarkably stable. The compressed snow hardened into a dense ice-like surface that resisted erosion and maintained its shape through the winter. The tunnel floor, which received the most wear from crawling traffic, was repacked monthly with fresh snow to maintain the smooth, hard surface that made crawling comfortable. The January storm of 1893 tested the tunnel under extreme conditions. The storm delivered 36 inches of fresh snow over 2 days, with sustained winds of 45 miles per hour that created drifts exceeding 6 feet against the cabin's north wall. The tunnel entrance was buried under 4 feet of drift snow, and the tunnel itself was compressed by the weight of the additional snowpack above it. Tarak dug out the entrance in 40 minutes, working from inside the tunnel outward, pushing the snow through the passage and out the cabin door where Mary shoveled it aside, and found that the tunnel structure had held. The pole and snow roof had compressed slightly under the additional weight, but had not collapsed, and the walls, hardened by weeks of freeze-thaw cycling, had maintained their shape. The tunnel was operational within an hour of the storm's end. During the storm itself, while the tunnel entrance was buried and the tunnel was effectively sealed, the cabin had been more airtight than at any other time, because the buried tunnel eliminated even the residual air exchange through the doorway. The cabin temperature during the storm held at 56 degrees with moderate stove burn, warmer than the neighboring cabins that were losing heat through their conventional doors, despite heavy blanket curtains and makeshift vestibules. The neighbor who understood the tunnel first was Frank Bridger, a former Army scout who had spent time in the Northern Territories and who had seen Inuit snow houses during his service. Bridger visited Tarak's cabin in February 1892, crawled through the tunnel, stepped up into the warm cabin, and immediately grasped the principle. He had seen the Katak in the Arctic, the sunken entrance passages of the Inuit sod houses, and he recognized Tarak's tunnel as an above-ground adaptation of the same concept. Bridger asked one question: why doesn't everybody do this? The answer was that nobody else in the settlement had seen it, understood it, or thought of it, because the principle that a sunken entrance exploits the density difference between warm and cold air to create a passive thermal seal was not part of the European or American building tradition. The European tradition sealed doors with weather stripping and vestibules, physical barriers. The Inupiat tradition sealed doors with physics, density barriers. The two approaches were fundamentally different in concept, and the Inupiat approach was fundamentally superior in performance. Bridger built a snow tunnel at his own cabin the following week. His tunnel was shorter, 6 feet rather than 8, and wider, 4 feet, to accommodate his larger frame. But the principle was identical, and the results matched Tarak's. Virtually zero cold air infiltration through the doorway, immeasurable fuel savings, and the elimination of the cold floor blast that had accompanied every door opening for every winter of Bridger's Montana life. The spring thaw was the tunnel's natural end. As temperatures rose above freezing in March, the snow tunnel softened, sagged, and eventually collapsed, a gradual process that took approximately 2 weeks from the first sustained thaw to complete failure. Tarak did not attempt to preserve the tunnel through the thaw. The tunnel was a winter structure, built from winter's material, serving winter's purpose, and returning to water when winter ended. Each December, when the snow accumulated to sufficient depth, Tarak rebuilt the tunnel in approximately 4 hours, faster than the first construction, because the technique was refined, and the cabin's door sill and foundation provided the same reference points year after year. The annual reconstruction was a ritual that Mary and the boys participated in, James and Robert packing and shaping the snow walls, while Tarak laid the roof poles and packed the snow arch. By the third winter, the construction took 3 hours. By the fifth, 2.5. The family could build a functional snow tunnel between breakfast and lunch on the first heavy snow day of December, and the tunnel would serve them until the March thaw. 3 to 4 months of thermal protection for half a day's labor and zero material cost. The thermal performance of the snow tunnel improved over the course of each winter as the snow walls aged. Fresh-packed snow has an insulation value of approximately R1 per inch, modest but sufficient for the tunnel's purpose, which was not to insulate but to create the below-floor level passage that trapped cold air. As the winter progressed, the snow walls underwent a process called sintering. The individual snow crystals bonded together under pressure and temperature cycling, forming a denser, harder material with improved structural strength and slightly higher insulation value. By February, the tunnel walls were dense enough to support a person's weight without deformation, and the interior surface had developed a smooth glaze of ice from the repeated freeze-thaw of moisture in the tunnel air. The ice glaze on the tunnel walls had an unintended benefit. It reflected the dim light from the cabin door into the tunnel passage, creating a soft illumination that made crawling through the tunnel less disorienting than it would have been in total darkness. On moonlit nights, the tunnel entrance emitted a pale blue light that reflected off the ice walls and carried into the passage, producing an ethereal glow that Mary described as crawling through a cave of blue glass. The concept spread slowly through the settlement, more slowly than the box bed or the straw cellar, because the tunnel required a specific set of conditions that not every cabin possessed. The cabin floor had to be raised above ground level, at least 12 inches, preferably 18, to create the elevation difference between the tunnel floor and the cabin floor that was the basis of the thermal trap. Cabins built directly on the ground with floors at grade level could not use the tunnel because there was no step-up from the tunnel into the cabin, and without the step-up, the cold tunnel air would flow directly into the cabin at floor level, defeating the purpose. Of the 14 cabins in the settlement, 9 had raised floors sufficient for the tunnel, and 5 did not. Of the 9 eligible cabins, 6 eventually built snow tunnels. Taraks, Bridgers, and 4 others who adopted the technique between 1893 and 1898. The families with ground-level floors attempted modifications. One family, the Harpers, dug a trench 18 inches deep, leading from their door for 8 feet, creating an artificial below-floor entrance without raising the cabin itself. The trench worked as a thermal trap during cold, still weather, but filled with drifting snow during storms and required constant clearing. Another family built a raised wooden threshold inside the doorway, a 12-inch step-up that created a partial thermal barrier. But that was awkward to step over while carrying loads, and that tripped visitors who were unaccustomed to the obstacle. Neither modification matched the performance of Tarak's full tunnel on a raised floor cabin, but both provided measurable improvement over a conventional door. The comparison between the snow tunnel and the vestibule, the standard American solution to the cold door problem, demonstrated why the Inupiat approach was superior. A vestibule created a buffer zone between the cabin and the outside air. When the outer vestibule door was closed and the inner cabin door opened, the cabin air exchanged with the vestibule air rather than the outside air. A warmer exchange, but still an exchange. The vestibule air was typically 20 to 30 degrees warmer than the outside air, but 30 to 40 degrees colder than the cabin air. Each door opening still cost heat, less than a direct opening, but significant over 20 daily cycles. The snow tunnel eliminated the exchange entirely. The cabin air did not exchange with the tunnel air because the density barrier prevented mixing. The tunnel was not a buffer, it was a seal. The vestibule reduced the problem. The tunnel solved it. Mary Redhawk's adaptation of the tunnel for food storage was a practical innovation that extended the tunnel's value beyond thermal protection. She noticed that the tunnel maintained a stable temperature of approximately 20 to 25 degrees throughout the winter, cold enough to preserve meat and other perishables, but warm enough to prevent the deep freezing that made stored food difficult to thaw and prepare. She began storing covered pots of stew, wrapped cuts of meat, and sealed containers of milk in the tunnel, using the stable cold temperature as a natural refrigerator that was accessible from inside the cabin without going outside. The tunnel became a cold pantry, a food storage space that was always at the ideal preservation temperature, always accessible, and always free. Tarak lived on the Montana homestead until 1908, when he and Mary moved to a small town near Great Falls to be closer to a school for the boys. The snow tunnel was rebuilt every winter for 17 years, each reconstruction taking less time than the last as the family refined the technique to a practiced routine. The tunnel served its purpose perfectly every year. Zero cold air at floor level, measurable fuel savings, and the quiet satisfaction of a principle that had kept Tarak's ancestors warm on the Chukchi Sea coast, applied successfully to a log cabin on the Montana plains, 6,000 miles from the Arctic, but governed by the same physics. James, the older boy, carried the knowledge forward. He built snow tunnels at his own homestead south of Great Falls from 1905 onward, and he taught the technique to his neighbors, not as an Inupiat practice, but as a practical solution to a universal problem: the cold air that pours through every door, every winter, stealing heat that the stove has labored to produce. The tunnel required no special skills, no purchased materials, and no permanent modification to the cabin. It required only snow, which the Montana winter provided in abundance, and the understanding that cold air is heavier than warm air, and that a passage below the floor will trap the cold below while the warmth stays above. The wind protection provided by the snow tunnel was a secondary benefit that proved as valuable as the thermal seal in the extreme conditions of the Montana high plains. The wind on the high plains east of the Rocky Mountain front was not the gentle breeze of sheltered valleys. It was a sustained assault that blew 20 to 30 miles per hour on calm days and 40 to 60 during storms, driving the effective temperature down by 20 to 30 degrees below the air temperature and forcing cold air through every crack, gap, and opening in the cabin with a pressure that no chinking or weather stripping could fully resist. The cabin door was the largest opening, and on the windward side of the cabin, the wind pressure against the door was sufficient to force cold air through the gaps around the frame, even when the door was closed, a phenomenon called pressure infiltration that accounted for a significant portion of total heat loss in exposed cabins. The snow tunnel eliminated pressure infiltration through the door entirely. The tunnel entrance, located at ground level 8 feet from the cabin, was oriented perpendicular to the prevailing wind direction, a deliberate choice by Tarak that prevented the wind from blowing directly into the tunnel opening. The tunnel walls and roof blocked the wind from reaching the cabin door, and the door, now sheltered behind 8 feet of snow walls, experienced zero wind pressure, even during severe storms. The door could be latched loosely or even left slightly ajar without cold air being forced through the gaps, because the wind that had been driving the infiltration could not reach the door. The effect on cabin comfort during wind events was dramatic. Before the tunnel, the north wall of the cabin, facing the prevailing wind, was the coldest surface in the building, and the door on that wall was the primary infiltration point. During high wind events, The cabin temperature on the north side could be 10 to 15 degrees colder than on the south side, creating a thermal gradient that no amount of stovework could eliminate because the wind was continuously forcing cold air through the door frame. After the tunnel, the door was removed from the wind equation entirely, and the north wall temperature equalized with the rest of the cabin. Still the coldest wall because of its exposure, but no longer the source of active infiltration that created the worst cold zone in the room. The psychology of the snow tunnel was an aspect that surprised Tarak because it was so different from the Inupiat experience. In the Arctic, the Katak was normal. Every house had one, every person crawled through one several times a day, and the act of descending into a passage, crawling through it, and emerging into a warm interior was as unremarkable as opening a door. In Montana, the snow tunnel was alien, the American and European settlers who encountered it for the first time experienced a range of reactions from curiosity to amusement to outright resistance. The idea of crawling on hands and knees through a snow passage to enter one's own home violated the upright entry expectation that was so fundamental to European building culture that most people could not articulate it. They simply felt that entering a house should involve walking through a door, standing up, in daylight, and that crawling through a dark tunnel was undignified, uncomfortable, and vaguely threatening. The resistance was strongest among the families who had the most to gain from the tunnel. The Callaways, a family from Kentucky with 5 children and a poorly insulated cabin that consumed 6 cords of wood per winter, refused to consider the tunnel despite Bridger's enthusiastic recommendation. Mrs. Callaway said she would not crawl into her own house like an animal, and Mr. Callaway, though privately interested in the fuel savings, did not overrule her. The Callaways continued to lose 20 to 30% of their fuel through door-related heat loss. For every winter they remained in the settlement, a cost of approximately 2 cords per year, $12 in firewood, sacrificed to the preference for an upright entrance. The families who adopted the tunnel overcame the resistance through a single experience. One trip through the passage, one emergence into the warm cabin, one morning of opening the door without feeling the cold floor blast, and the resistance evaporated. Bridger, who had seen the Katak in the Arctic and arrived predisposed to accept it, required no convincing. The other 4 families who eventually adopted the tunnel each followed the same pattern. Initial skepticism, a single demonstration at Tarak's cabin, and immediate adoption. The tunnel was, as Bridger said, one of those things that sounds ridiculous until you try it, and then it sounds ridiculous that you ever lived without it. The construction method that Tarak refined over 17 winters produced a tunnel that was stronger, warmer, and more durable than his first attempt. The key refinement was the double wall technique. Rather than packing a single thickness of snow into the tunnel walls, Tarak built 2 walls, an inner wall of packed snow 6 inches thick, a gap of 4 inches, and an outer wall of packed snow 6 inches thick, creating a dead air space within the wall that doubled the insulation value and reduced the rate at which the tunnel interior cooled in extreme cold. The double wall tunnel maintained an interior temperature of 25 to 28 degrees, even when the outside air dropped to 30 below, approximately 5 degrees warmer than the single wall tunnel under the same conditions. The warmer tunnel meant a smaller temperature step between the tunnel and the cabin, which further reduced the already minimal air mixing at the cabin door. The second refinement was the curved entrance. The first tunnel had a straight 8-foot passage from entrance to door. Tarak found that wind could, on occasion, blow directly down the length of a straight tunnel if the wind direction shifted to align with the tunnel's axis. A rare event, but one that temporarily defeated the wind protection benefit. In the second winter, Katak built the tunnel with a 90-degree bend at the midpoint, the first 4 feet running perpendicular to the cabin wall, then turning and running parallel to the wall for 4 feet before reaching the door. The bend prevented any wind direction from having a direct path through the tunnel, and the still air conditions inside the tunnel were maintained regardless of wind direction or speed. The third refinement was the entrance design. The first tunnel had a simple open hole at ground level, functional but prone to snow infiltration during blowing storms. By the fourth winter, Katak was building the entrance with a slight downward slope. The tunnel floor descended approximately 6 inches from the entrance to the midpoint before rising back to the cabin door level. This dip in the floor created a cold air trap at the tunnel entrance. The coldest outside air, being the densest, sank into the dip and pooled there rather than flowing through the full length of the tunnel to the cabin door. The result was that the air at the cabin door end of the tunnel was consistently 5 to 8 degrees warmer than the air at the entrance end, further reducing the thermal gradient between the tunnel and the cabin interior. The seasonal pattern of the tunnel's performance tracked with the snow conditions of the Montana winter. In December, when the tunnel was newly built from fresh soft snow, the insulation value was lowest and the interior temperature was 20 to 22 degrees. By January, after weeks of cold weather had sintered and hardened the snow walls, the temperature rose to 23 to 25 degrees. By February, with the double wall construction fully aged and the ice glaze on the interior surfaces providing an additional layer of insulation, the tunnel reached its peak performance, 25 to 28 degrees interior temperature with 0 wind infiltration at the cabin door. March brought the beginning of deterioration. Daytime thawing softened the outer surface of the walls. Nighttime refreezing created a hard shell, but weakened the interior structure, and by mid-March the tunnel was showing signs of structural fatigue that would end in collapse by the end of the month. The safety of the tunnel was a concern that Katak addressed from the first winter. The primary risk was roof collapse. The pole and snow roof, bearing the weight of accumulated snowfall, could fail and trap or injure a person crawling through the passage. Katak's mitigation was structural redundancy. The roof poles were spaced 6 inches apart rather than 12, providing twice the support of the minimum necessary, and each pole was selected for straightness and strength. No cracked, bent, or undersized poles were used. In 17 winters of use, the tunnel roof never collapsed while occupied. 2 partial collapses occurred during Katak's absence, both in March during the thaw cycle, both at the midpoint of the tunnel where the weight accumulation was greatest, and both were repaired within an hour by clearing the debris and repacking the roof. The second safety concern was the theoretical risk of carbon monoxide accumulation in the tunnel. If the stove's exhaust somehow entered the passage, this risk was negligible in practice. The stove's exhaust exited through the chimney, which was on the opposite side of the cabin from the tunnel entrance, and the tunnel's natural ventilation, cold air entering at the entrance, slightly warmer air exiting at the cabin door, prevented any stagnation of gases. Katak monitored the tunnel air quality by the simple method of observing his breathing while crawling through. Any headache, dizziness, or unusual smell would indicate air quality problems, and detected no issues in any winter of the tunnel's operation. The economic analysis of the snow tunnel was remarkable for its simplicity. The tunnel cost nothing, $0 for materials. The snow was free. $0 for tools. Tarak used a flat board for packing and a shovel for shaping, both of which he already owned. $0 for hardware or purchase supplies. The only cost was labor, 4 hours for the initial construction in the first year, declining to 2.5 hours by the 5th year, and the 20 minutes per week of maintenance during the winter. Against this $0 cost, the tunnel saved approximately 1¼ cords of wood per winter, $7.50, making the return on investment technically infinite. No other thermal improvement on the frontier, not the straw cellar, not the sand bed, not the box bed, not the massive chimney, achieved the same thermal benefit at zero material cost. The cultural significance of the snow tunnel in the Montana settlement was complicated by the racial dynamics of the frontier. Tarak was Inupiat in a settlement of predominantly white American settlers, and the adoption of his engineering innovation required the settlers to acknowledge that an indigenous man possessed knowledge superior to their own on a matter of fundamental importance, keeping warm in winter. Some settlers made this acknowledgement easily. Bridger, who had respect for indigenous knowledge from his years of frontier experience, and the Driscoll family, who were recent immigrants with no entrenched attitudes about the relative capabilities of different peoples. Others struggled. The Callaways' refusal was partly cultural, rooted in a reluctance to adopt a practice associated with indigenous people, even when the practical benefit was obvious and the physics were unarguable. Tarak did not press the matter. He built his tunnel every December, maintained it through the winter, and welcomed anyone who wanted to see it, learn from it, or try it. He explained the principle with the patience of a man who understood that knowledge travels at its own speed and that the best demonstration is the one that stands in place and waits to be noticed. Over 17 winters, 6 of the settlement's 14 families adopted the tunnel, a 43% adoption rate that, while lower than the box bed's eventual universal adoption, represented a significant transfer of indigenous engineering knowledge into the broader frontier community. The warmth that Tarak brought from the Arctic to Montana was not a trade secret or a proprietary technique. It was open knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of Inupiat survival in the most extreme cold environment on Earth, knowledge that had been developed, refined, and transmitted across generations through oral tradition and hands-on demonstration. The Katak principle, that a sunken entrance exploits the density difference between warm and cold air, was knowledge that belonged to no individual and could not be owned, only shared. Tarak shared it freely, and the families who adopted it benefited measurably, and the families who refused it lost measurably, and the principle itself, warm air rises, cold air sinks, and a passage below the floor traps the cold, remained true regardless of who built the tunnel or what they thought of the man who showed them how. The psychology of the snow tunnel was an aspect that surprised Tarak because it was so different from the Inupiat experience. In the Arctic, the Katak was normal. Every house had one. Every person crawled through one several times a day, and the act of descending into a passage, crawling through it, and emerging into a warm interior was as unremarkable as opening a door. In Montana, the snow tunnel was alien. The American and European settlers who encountered it for the first time experienced a range of reactions from curiosity to amusement to outright resistance. The idea of crawling on hands and knees through a snow passage to enter one's own home violated the upright entry expectation that was so fundamental to European building culture that most people could not articulate it. They simply felt that entering a house should involve walking through a door standing up, in daylight, and that crawling through a dark tunnel was undignified and uncomfortable. The resistance was strongest among the families who had the most to gain from the tunnel. The Callaways, a family from Kentucky with 5 children and a poorly insulated cabin that consumed 6 cords of wood per winter, refused to consider the tunnel despite Bridger's enthusiastic recommendation. Mrs. Callaway said she would not crawl into her own house like an animal, and Mr. Callaway, though privately interested in the fuel savings, did not overrule her. The Callaways continued to lose 20 to 30% of their fuel through door-related heat loss for every winter they remained in the settlement. The families who adopted the tunnel overcame the resistance through a single experience: one trip through the passage, one emergence into the warm cabin, one morning of opening the door without feeling the cold floor blast, and the resistance evaporated. The tunnel was, as Bridger said, one of those things that sounds ridiculous until you try it, and then it sounds ridiculous that you ever lived without it. The seasonal performance of the tunnel tracked with the aging of the snow. In December, when newly built from fresh, soft snow, the walls provided modest insulation, and the interior temperature was 20 to 22 degrees. By January, after weeks of cold had sintered and hardened the snow crystals into a dense bonded mass, the temperature climbed to 23 to 25 degrees. By February, with the double wall construction fully aged and the ice glaze on interior surfaces adding another layer of insulation, the tunnel reached peak performance, 25 to 28 degrees with 0 wind at the cabin door. March brought deterioration. Daytime thawing softened the outer surface. Nighttime refreezing created a hard shell, but weakened the interior, and by mid-March, the tunnel showed the fatigue that would end in collapse by month's end. The February blizzard of 1895 was the most severe test the tunnel faced. The storm delivered 40 inches of new snow over 3 days with sustained winds of 50 miles per hour and temperatures reaching 35 below zero. The wind chill exceeded 70 below. Visibility dropped to 0. 3 families in the settlement could not reach their woodpiles and burned furniture for fuel. One family's barn collapsed under the snow load, killing 2 horses. Tarak's tunnel held through the entire storm. The double wall construction, now in its 4th winter and refined to its strongest version, absorbed the additional snow load without deformation. The curved passage blocked the 50-mile-per-hour wind completely. The air inside the tunnel was dead still, even as the wind screamed over the snow surface above. The entrance buried under 3 feet of drift snow on the first day, but Tarak cleared it from inside the tunnel in 30 minutes each morning, pushing the snow outward with a flat board. During the storm, the cabin maintained 54 degrees with moderate stove burn, the highest temperature of any cabin in the settlement, despite Tarak's cabin having only average insulation. The difference was entirely attributable to the tunnel. While every other cabin was losing heat through door infiltration every time someone opened the door for wood, water, or any other necessity, Tarak's cabin lost essentially 0 heat through the door because the tunnel's thermal seal held, regardless of how often or how long the door was open. Over 3 days of storm conditions, with the door opened 6 to 8 times per day for tunnel passages, the cumulative heat loss through Tarak's doorway was equivalent to approximately 1 door opening in a conventional cabin. The other families lost the equivalent of 18 to 24 full air exchanges over the same period. The visibility inside the tunnel during the blizzard was a detail that Mary remembered for years afterward. With the entrance cleared each morning, but the storm raging outside, the tunnel entrance admitted a diffuse white light that bounced off the ice-glazed walls and filled the passage with a soft, even illumination, brighter than moonlight, dimmer than daylight, steady and calm. The wind was inaudible inside the tunnel. The blizzard that was destroying barns and threatening lives on the surface was, from inside the tunnel, a distant event. Something happening in another world, separated from the warm, calm passage by 3 feet of packed snow that blocked the sound, the wind, and the cold with equal indifference. The load-carrying limitation of the tunnel was the primary practical inconvenience. A person crawling through a 3-foot-wide, 3-foot-high passage could not carry large loads. Firewood had to be passed through the tunnel in individual pieces or small bundles rather than armloads. Water buckets had to be pushed ahead on the tunnel floor rather than carried, and any object wider than 2.5 feet could not pass through at all. Katak addressed the firewood problem by maintaining a woodpile inside the cabin, stacked against the south wall, replenished every few days by passing individual logs through the tunnel. The indoor woodpile held approximately 4 days' supply, reducing the frequency of wood-carrying trips to twice per week, rather than the daily trips required by families who stored all their wood outside. The water-carrying problem was more persistent. The family's water source was a spring 200 yards from the cabin, and the full water bucket, weighing approximately 40 pounds, had to be transported through the tunnel on a small wooden sled that Katak built specifically for the purpose. The sled, a flat platform 18 inches wide on 2 smooth runners, held the bucket securely and slid easily on the hard tunnel floor, allowing the person crawling behind it to push the loaded sled through the passage with one hand while crawling with the other. The technique worked well on the flat sections of the tunnel, but was awkward at the curved midpoint and at the step-up to the cabin floor, where the bucket had to be lifted from the sled and set on the cabin floor before the person could climb up from the tunnel. Mary performed this maneuver twice daily throughout the winter, a routine that required strength, balance, and patience, but that she preferred to the alternative of carrying an open bucket through a conventional door in a 40-mile-per-hour wind at 20 below zero. The tunnel's effect on the cabin's moisture balance was a benefit that became apparent only through comparison with conventional cabins over multiple winters. Every door opening in a conventional cabin admitted cold, dry air from the outside, air with an absolute humidity near zero in deep winter, and expelled warm, moist air from the cabin interior. Over 20 daily door openings, this air exchange systematically dried the cabin interior, reducing humidity to levels that cracked wooden furniture, split log walls, dried out leather goods, and irritated the respiratory tracts of the occupants. The tunnel, by eliminating the air exchange, preserved the cabin's interior humidity at the level generated by the family's activities, cooking, breathing, drying clothes, without the constant dilution by dry outside air. The result was a cabin that was noticeably more comfortable in midwinter. The air was not parching dry, the woodwork did not crack, and the family suffered fewer of the nosebleeds and sore throats that plagued settlers in well-ventilated conventional cabins. No myths, no miracles, just snow, a sunken passage, and the understanding that the best door is not the one that closes tightest. It is the one that lets cold air sink before it can rise.